My name is Julia. I'm the education coordinator here with Big Sky Film Institute. Thank you so much for joining us for our second official film club of this year. The NFI Film Club is part of our Native Filmmaker Initiative here at Big Sky Film Institute, and it's a way that we are working to get more Native and Indigenous nonfiction films into the classroom and have an engaging, interactive discussion. So we thank people like Gina and Christina and Mike Jetty also for joining us and helping us move along the dialogue. It makes it really fun for everybody. Just to start off, I was hoping we could start with introductions here. If Christina, if you want to start off, and then we will move to Gina, if you could just tell us about your personal relationship with Wilma Mankiller, who the film is about, and we will be showing a clip after we do introductions. So those of you that weren't able to see it, hold tight, and we will have a little activity for you here in a second. But Christina, if you could tell us your personal relationship with Wilma and how you got involved in the film, that would be great.
Hi. Wilma and I met through our work in the women's movement. And as I got to know, and that was over 25 years before she passed away. And as I got to know Wilma, I felt like that was the one story that had never been told in Hollywood or anything else. And Wilma and I stayed friends for 25 years, and we worked on the movie The Cherokee Word for Water for 21 years before she passed away and made her husband Charlie promise to get that movie done. She and I were friends, and she had a lot of medical issues, and I was helpful there as well.
Thank you. And Gina, if you could introduce yourself, your relationship with Wilma, and talk about your involvement in the film.
Sure. Hello to you all. I'm in Oklahoma. My relationship with Wilma Mankiller is I'm her youngest daughter, Gina. I have an older sister, Felicia. There are only two of us. We had the fortunate opportunity to be with Mom throughout a lot of different chapters in her life, which I'll talk about later. So we have a bit of a unique perspective of who Wilma Mankiller was before she became chief of the Cherokee Nation, and a woman who was passionate about working on every issue from leadership to stray dogs and cats to women and children's issues and so on and so forth. So and then how I got involved in the film was obviously because I'm her daughter. We had access to people or knowledge of people with whom touched Mom's life throughout the course of her life, not just in politics, but we also had family photos and other types of things. So we were asked, my sister and I were asked to be a contributor there.
Great, and we will be diving into more of that history here as the discussion moves along. And lastly, Mike Jetty here is with us with the Office of Public Instruction. He's an Indian education specialist. He has joined us with film clubs in the past. If you don't mind just reintroducing yourself and giving us a little background before we show the clip, that'd be great.
All right, Mike Jetty, member of the Spirit Lake Dakota Nation, Turtle Mountain Chippewa descendant. Just glad to be here today, work at OPI with Indian Education. And last night I was home watching PBS, and the film Mankiller was on the World Channel. And so I rewatched it again. It was pretty powerful, and had my youngest daughter sit down and watch it. And it was nice to see that out there, and it made me feel really good. So I'm glad to be part of the discussion today. So thank you.
And thank you guys. We're happy to have you. So next up, we're going to show about a 5-minute clip of the film for those of you that weren't able to watch the film beforehand, and for those of you who did watch it and need a refresher. For a little prep work, I want everybody, all the classes, to take out a piece of paper and fold it in half if you have one.
Oh, look at them.
Oh, you guys are ready. And And on one side of the paper, you can hold it up horizontally. On one side of the paper, I want you to write, I notice, at the top, on the top left. And on the right, I want you to write, I wonder. And under the I notice column, I want you, as we watch the clip, to write down observations that you notice about the film. What do you learn about William Mankiller? What is important to her? What are things that she emphasizes as we, just from this 5-minute clip? It doesn't have to be anything big. Is it family or community or values? Who is being interviewed? Just some examples of questions or observations you might have. And then on the right-hand side, on the I wonder column, these are questions that you might have based on the clip. Things that aren't properly explained, or, you know, things about Wilma that you want to know more about. And we will dive into those questions after we watch this clip. So we'll start off with this clip, and then we will come back into discussion. Are we ready?
When Wilma Mankiller was 10, she and her family were relocated from Cherokee lands in Oklahoma to San Francisco. It was in San Francisco during the Civil Rights era that she found her voice and a belief in the power to make change.
Ladies and gentlemen, please meet the Cherokee Nation Chief of Chiefs.
A lot of people told her not to do it.
She had death threats.
They were fearful of a woman leadership.
Mankiller has been credited with revitalizing the Cherokee Nation. She's appeared before congressional committees and met with 3 presidents.
A man teased me about my name, which is Mankiller. He asked me about the origin of it, and I told him it was a nickname and I'd earned it. And my own personal perspective is that I'm a pretty ordinary person that just happened to be given an opportunity to do extraordinary things in my life. I feel very fortunate that I was born Cherokee, that I was born in a community like that. My whole life has played itself out within a set of reciprocal relationships with my family and with the community and with friends.
Your life changed at the age of 11 when you moved to California. That was traumatic, wasn't it?
My parents were thinking it would provide an opportunity for a better life for us to grow up in a modern world. The life that we'd anticipated did not turn out the way it had been described to us. Like a lot of other people who grew up in poverty and rural areas, we actually didn't know we were poor until later.
Cherokees were the poorest class of people in northeastern Oklahoma, when once we were the reigning class. There was nobody outside of real Cherokee communities that wanted to be Cherokee.
We had no indoor plumbing, no electricity, no access to any kind of modern amenities. So our world was very isolated and very insulated. And we had a small house and a lot of children, so a lot of our world was outside, which is a wondrous world.
She felt a connection with this land, with this piece of land that I've always belonged to the Mankiller family, and this is where she grew up, and this is where love was. Love was here.
I would say we were economically poor, but not poor in other ways. We were rich in many other ways.
We had a treaty with Britain even before we had a treaty with the United States or one of the colonies. Our land in the southeast in Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama was good land for growing tobacco, good land for growing cotton, and there was gold. Prior to significant contact with the non-Indian people, Cherokee women had a very prominent role. There was a very powerful woman that they used to call the beloved woman.
Cherokee people are a matriarchal society. Our clan membership translates to us through our mothers.
The children belong to the women. The property belonged to the women. The house belonged to the women. And men would come in and they would live in the women's homes, but typically they'd be out hunting. They would come and go. In Cherokee mythology, the sun is female because the sun is always there. Women are always there. The moon was male because, you know, sometimes the moon's there, sometimes it's not. Unfortunately, with colonization, women were viewed as chattel and were owned by men.
It was the advent of European patriarchal culture and religious ideas. The U.S. government ridiculed and made fun of Cherokee and other matrilineal cultures. They called it a petticoat government because the female elders had to sign the treaties along with male elders.
The federal government once had as their policy to wipe us off the face of the earth. There began to be discussion of removing the entire tribe, our entire tribe, to Indian Territory, what is now the state of Oklahoma. President Jackson, who made his reputation as an Indian fighter, sent out the U.S. Army to gather up Cherokee families and take them to stockades where they were held in the southeast. Historians began to refer to that removal as the Trail of Tears. And by the time
we're going to stop it there. And I know there's a lot to see. For those of you that weren't able to see the entire film, that's kind of a teaser trailer for you to be able to watch it and discuss a little bit more. But I think that's a great starting point for us for today's discussion. That's just the beginning, first 5 or 6 minutes or so. I want to start off, before we open up questions for Christina and Gina, I want to open up it up to the classes here. I was wondering if a few students from some of the classes might want to share a few of the things they wrote that they noticed from this film, maybe observations of what did you learn about Wilma Mankiller?
Let's start with Moore.
Yeah.
Moore School. Just unmute your microphone.
Go ahead. Do you have something? Do you have something, Dawson? What did you notice?
Don't be.
She's a very independent person.
Yeah, she's a very independent person.
Okay, great.
Great observation.
Does somebody else in Moore have an observation?
Let's do one more from Moore, and then we'll do, we'll go to another class.
I noticed she seemed really connected to the land.
Yes, she's very connected to the land. She does mention Oklahoma, and I think Gina also, who is with us here today, mentions that as well. That's a really good observation.
Okay, that's all we have right now.
Great, thank you guys for sharing. Can we go to another class?
Seeley.
Seeley, if you want to have, if we could have 2 people share.
She's strong, helpful, and loving.
Yes. She's very concerned about the community. I think that's a great observation. If we could have one more student.
Even though she had a whole bunch of people tell her bad things, she never quit on what she was planning to do.
Yes. She's very perseverant, resilient. Those are really great observations. Thank you guys so much for sharing those. And I want you to think about those I wonder questions as we continue this discussion. And I'm just going to open it up. Maybe we could start with Gina. This film starts with talking about Wilma Mankiller's childhood, during which her family was relocated from Oklahoma to San Francisco. And I'm wondering, because this is such a personal story for you, being the daughter of Wilma Mankiller, if you could talk about that relocation, what that was like for the family, and if it was scary, and maybe who were involved in making those decisions.
Okay. Well, Mom was about almost 11 when it happened, years old, and so my grandfather, being the patriarch of the family, mind you, this is in the 50s, in the 1950s, was approached by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, an agent, saying, we have a better life for you if we moved you to these locations. So Grandpa picked San Francisco, California, sold everything, threw him and all of his children and his wife on a train, and went to California not knowing what to expect. So when they get to California, there's no welcome committee in San Francisco that's saying, hey, man killers, welcome, to this location. There was nothing. So he had to figure it out for himself. So their first days there were spent in a kind of a seedy hotel. But you have to remember that this was in the 1950s. If any of you have read books or know anything about the era back then, Mom lived in a house with no running water and no electricity and no sort of influence in what was happening in the world around because they lived in a rural setting. So they saw an elevator, for example, for the first time and was mortified that the doors open and it ate people. So that's what they thought in their little young minds, is that this thing is opening and they never see these people again. So they took the stairs. They had never seen a flushing toilet before. So everything that about the sirens, she said, sounded like wolves howling and things of that nature. So it was definitely a really scary time for them to move from what is rural Oklahoma, where your cousins live right down, the road, and you play and you do all of that, to this very urban area for the 1950s that you had no clue how to get along. So without a huge amount of help, they ended up in a very poor neighborhood near San Francisco, and that's the way they grew up. So it was extremely scary for her and her brothers and sisters, and it was a huge way to adapt your way of life of only knowing how to be a person in rural America to going into an urban setting like San Francisco.
Yeah, I think that speaks to a lot of us here in Montana. Montana is a big state with a lot of rural area, and I'm not sure if any of the classrooms have had to move, or maybe their parents said, hey, we're moving, and they didn't have much of a decision about it. But this kind of this idea of who makes these decisions and how much of that is an equal relationship, I think, is an important one. Mike, I'm wondering if you could explain to us and the classes a little bit more about the Bureau of Indian Affairs relocation plan and a little backstory on what this plan was and what it meant for Native Americans in the U.S.
Sure. Throughout history, there have been several different federal Indian policy periods, and I think I can share my screen, can I?
Yes, you should be able to.
You can
I've
sure
tried
try.
this before. We'll see if I can. But anyway, there are several different federal policy periods that. Here we go. Share monitor. That'll bring up my screen.
Try it.
Can you see that?
Can the students see it?
Can the students see?
Yeah, we can't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, there are different policy periods from colonization to treaties. That was mentioned in the film. Boarding schools, where students were sent off to boarding school. You heard a little bit of that in the film. But the period they're talking about is this one, termination and relocation. There was an idea to terminate tribes, but at the same time they said, well, let's say that you're no longer tribal members, you're just regular U.S. citizens. And then the idea was to relocate folks to, urban areas, to different cities. And the whole goal was, let's turn these Indians into, basically white people. And it didn't work too good. And so, I'm trying to get my screen back up. Can you see What can you see right now on there?
Let's have Celie unmute their microphone and tell us what they're seeing.
The lady.
Yeah, we're just seeing you.
We're just seeing us now.
Okay.
Okay.
I gotta try and figure out how to switch my screen here.
Different. We move so slow.
But, you know, I guess you think about federal union policy, and the part that I think Wilma Mankiller played into quite a bit was this part about self-determination, and that the federal government decided, well, these programs we've had, termination, relocation, you know, boarding schools, those didn't work too well, and so it's now let's let tribes make their own decisions about their own futures. And people like Wilma Mankiller led, you know, the movement for that. You think about, you know, in the film they talk about Indian gaming and what that brought to the tribe, but the fight for that too, and so that's a big deal. But just so you know that there's been all these policies that the government thought was best for natives, and then they realized maybe we should switch how we deal with tribes, and they did, and that's the current era we're living in right now. So.
Yeah, I think a few classes brought up, and the things I noticed in the clip that we showed was that this resiliency and this importance of community was really important to Wilma. And Christina, I know you've worked with Wilma in a variety of settings of community organizing, and I know you have a personal relationship with her as well. Do you mind talking about how Wilma encouraged this kind of collaboration between all sorts of different people? And I think you might be able to speak to that.
Yeah. Wilma was one of the most light people I've ever encountered. And so even in controversy, she would figure out how to bring people together. I'm going to use an example from the project, the Bell Project, which was what we based the Cherokee word for water on. And in that, they inspired the Bell community to build their own 18-mile water line with volunteer labor. Now imagine that, kids, building 18 miles of water line with volunteers. And it was a community, there were communities around there that had histories of conflict between them, where families would fight each other, other families would shoot at each other. And what she did, she and Charlie, the man who became her husband, what they did was they broke that 18 miles into 2-mile segments. And everybody in the communities had to work on some portion of a 2-mile segment. And in those 2-mile segments, they put together people who had traditionally fought each other. And so, have you ever been on a team where you have people who you don't really like, and then suddenly you're team members and you have to fight for the same goal together? That's the kind of thing she did with such heart. She was really quite inspiring that way. She also figured out how to use government. One of the other things that I think Wilma was really important in what she did is, because of who Wilma was, she would get a meeting with somebody important. And Wilma would always bring people along with her into those meetings so that those other people who didn't have the same access she did would know the same power people that she did, and they would be able to get change for their Indian communities or communities of women or whatever communities. One last thing, when she did her healthcare and medical institutions, they were out in rural areas. She made it available to non-Indians as well, so that instead of it causing people to resent each other, services for Indians were able to be provided to non-Indians as well.
That's a really great point. I think we could open it up. I'm curious if people have some questions that they've written in their I wonder column that they might have for Gina, Mike, Christina, or I before we move on to with the discussion. Should we start with Moore? Does anybody have a question? Maybe we'll pick one person from Moore to ask a question.
So, at the beginning of the film, they were talking on how the sun, they thought the sun as a woman and the moon as a man. Did they believe that the women had more power than the men? Or was it just that they're always there?
No, Cherokees were equal. There was no one had power over the other. Everyone lived in a harmonious balance. Everything was balanced in life. Just because one had these chores and the other one didn't, or one did these and the other one didn't, it was still seen as a balance.
Ooh.
I think that ought to be mentioned is when one of the senators went through the original Cherokee communities, he commented that there was not a pauper among the Cherokee. People helped each other, and a pauper is a poor person. There were no poor people in the original Cherokee communities because people helped each other.
Very communal. Do we have any questions from
Seeley?
Seeley?
Anyone have a question?
No.
Oh, go ahead, Cora.
Well, in the film it talked about like the gaming, how this got gaming in the Cherokee tribe, and then what was that? Like, why did they want the gaming and not something else?
Why did they choose gaming and not another source of income?
Well, with Cherokee Nation, we do have other sources of income, not just gaming. In 2009, Cherokee Nation developed what is now called Cherokee Nation Diversified Businesses. And we have entered into $80 to $100 million worth of mostly 8A contracting, and somebody else can explain that to high school children, but in government contracting basically for minorities to help diversify the portfolio that we have here at Cherokee Nation. So from us, making money is not just about gaming anymore. It's about looking at other ways they're using gaming money to benchmark into other avenues of creating jobs and creating revenue for the tribe. We still have contracts where we do cabling and some other things for government vehicles and Humvees and some other things. So with the Cherokee Nation specifically, that's no longer the case. It's not just gaming.
Great question. I'm wondering, since we're talking about kind of this independence that's gained with things like the gaming system and whatnot within the Cherokee Nation, can you, Gina or Christina or Mike, can you give us a little background on how big the Cherokee Nation is, the location, just to make sure students know where it is and that history, or just kind of that quick background? Gina, you're welcome to take this one.
Okay, well, the Cherokee Nation today is located in northeastern Oklahoma. There are 14 counties, some of them may be in a different area where they call them parishes, but where there are 14 counties within northeastern Oklahoma that make up what we call the Cherokee Nation here in Oklahoma, which that means is that we cohabitate, we co-live with Oklahomans within the boundaries of these 14 counties. In the last count that was published, we had almost 360,000 citizens who can prove that they are of Cherokee ancestry. So it makes us the largest Native American tribe in the United States. What else do you want to know?
Well, that is great.
I would also add in that there, just in case the kids come across it, there's the eastern band of the Cherokees that are located in Cherokee, North Carolina. And when the relocation happened, people disappeared into the woods and stayed in North Carolina. And that's the nexus of the what's known as the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation. They have separate governments, but they are both Cherokee.
And just as a visual, it might be useful maybe after this film club if teachers are able to bring up a map of where the Cherokee Nation is around Oklahoma and just show how big that area is and even just how much it's shrunk and how much that land was originally theirs and what the U.S. government had kind of shrunk it down to, because that's a pretty stunning visualization. I want to talk a little bit about, in the film, they talk about the term matriarchy versus patriarchy. I'm curious which classes are familiar or maybe know what this term means.
Show of hands.
Maybe a show of hands. Yeah, that's great. If you've heard this before, or this is your first time hearing it, does somebody want to explain to us? Maybe in Sealy, I see a lot of hands. Does somebody want to explain what a matriarchy is?
So a matriarchy is more of a female role and leader, and then patriarchy is more a male leader.
Yes, that was exactly right. And Gina, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this comes into play within Cherokee history, and also Wilma as a role model, both as a female leader, but also just a leader within the Cherokee Nation.
Well, historically, we had a title called A Beloved Woman. And with the Cherokees, there's a really good read if you ever want to read about a good Cherokee. Her name was Nancy Ward. And how Nancy Ward became a beloved woman was her title, was that the Cherokees were in battle with another tribe, and her husband was killed, and she picked up his rifle and ran with the men and defeated whom it is that we were fighting. So she was given this title, and she was given a seat up to the council. She was able to make decisions on behalf of the tribe or the community or the areas that dealt with Cherokees back in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. So you fast forward that to today, what Mom did, she would have been, if we still use the title, she would have, I believe, been the next beloved woman because of the sacrifices that she made personally to go forth with the things that she believed were or should be true and just in all things in the society that we lived in the late 70s and 80s and 90s. So let me explain it this way. Leaders, and today you have to look at leaders when you're going to vote. I don't know how many of you have voted, but when you go to vote, you have to look at the quality of a leader. You have to look at the quality of leadership and what these people stand for. And with Mom, when you looked at her as a leader, you looked at someone who led with her heart and not her pocketbook, not for money, not for fame, not for fortune, not for partnerships. She did what she did because she had a true, deep-seated, heartfelt love for people of all races. Not just Cherokees, not just women and not just children for everyone. So when Mom was running for office, as she first ran for the deputy chief of the Cherokee Nation first, one of the most startling revelations that came through that is that people didn't think a woman could lead the tribe. So you have all of this history of us being what was mentioned as outsiders seeing as a petticoat government. So you have all of that up until the 80s, and it was a total reversal of that. And people did not want to elect her into office because she was a woman. So you've got to let that sink into you that then we thought we were all pretty innovative in the 1980s, but yet our tribal people who historically have had an even share with both male and female, did not think she should lead the tribe because she was a female.
But interestingly, a lot of the elders actually came around and were influential in supporting her and in reminding people of their cultural history, that in fact women's leadership was important and part of their history.
Yeah, in the film we really see how colonization really affected those Native American tribes in that sense, because they were pushing these ways of life onto a very, otherwise very progressive, very equal, communal, established form of government, if you will. Christina, I know you've worked as a...
They were cleaner. They had better teeth. They brushed their teeth. You know, it was at a time when Europeans thought it was dangerous to bathe. And, yeah, I mean, kids, you can appreciate that actually the Indians had it better. They cleaned their teeth and and were clean. They were kind of appalled by what the Europeans behaved like and smelled like
in the 50s.
Yeah. Hey, Mike, I know we talked about this kind of history of female leaders within various tribes, and it's important to note people like Wilma Mankiller and their leadership roles. Just as a person, really. I mean, gender kind of plays into it, but I'm wondering, I know we talked about women leaders that often get overlooked. You know, Wilma Mankiller was well known for being the first principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, but there have been a history of women within various tribes that don't get the credit they often deserve. I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about this history and share with us a few other examples.
Sure. You know, in my work with history and stuff and Indian education, we always, read about a lot of the men and their contributions, but we don't hear, how powerful women were in a lot of those tribal societies, matriarchal societies, and the role of women in important ceremonies, and, the culture bearers, I guess, with those tribes. And we recently put out a document that was put forth by the Montana Historical Society, but we put together a little publication called Resilience, and I'll bring that up on the screen, but it's stories of 20 Montana Native American women who made significant contributions to our state. Some of them were, indigenous warriors, fought at Little Bighorn. Some of them were hired out mercenaries that fought for other tribes. Some were guides. Some of these women worked with language revitalization. I'll see if I can at least pull up this publication and show you the cover of it. Can you see this?
Mm-hmm.
Can you see it?
It's called Resilient Stories of Montana Indian Women. And it's written kind of a middle school level, but they have all these amazing stories from these powerful Indian women here in Montana. And a woman who, I'll just scroll down here real quick to the end. There's a woman here that I want every kid in the state of Montana to know about, or basically every kid in the United States to know about, is who Eloise Cabell is. Eloise Cabell had the largest class action lawsuit against the U.S. government ever in U.S. history, and won. She sued the federal government on behalf of, hundreds of thousands of American Indians. And what she did was a historic thing. And so women like Eloise Cabell, Wilma Mankiller really helped, promote rights for all people, basically, because they're inspirational. I think that we can learn from their stories, and how can we, in our own lives, no matter where we're at, work for the common good, not just for Native people, not just for women, but for everyone, regardless of our, differences and, beliefs and stuff. But, we're all here together now, and how do we all, live together in a good way? And Wilma Mankiller is an excellent example, like what you say, a bridge builder, bringing people together with different opinions and perspectives, and finding common ground. I think that's a lesson all of us can learn from today. So
I would add that Cobell was recently inducted just a month or so ago into the Native American Hall of Fame in their first class, as was LaDonna Harris. And I suggest for your Big Sky Film Institute to get Indian 101, which is the documentary on LaDonna Harris. There, another woman was inducted who is Maria Tallchief, who is a dancer, a prima ballerina. And so there are a whole range of ways that Native women have contributed. And by the way, for the first time ever, 3 Native women have been elected to our Congress. The U.S. House of Representatives, 3, for the first time ever to even have one in this last election.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. I was going to mention it earlier, and just the significance of that. I mean, it's 2018, and it's happening for the first time. And I think, a lot of the classes here today maybe aren't old enough to vote, but it's important to acknowledge, like we're saying, who our leaders are. And it defines what our laws are and where our voices come from, and the diversity of people that we see. It helps us all have a lot more of a voice.
Questions?
And I think it's a good opportunity to open it back up to questions. Of maybe people have some questions in their I wonder column, or they notice some things and want to comment about it. We'll start with Moore again. Does anybody have questions for Moore?
Okay, go ahead.
So,
Speak up.
people didn't want to elect her for the leader of the tribe. But was that because they thought she wasn't capable, or was it because she was a woman?
It's a great question. Did we hear that? Was Wilma Mankiller, the reason why people didn't want her elected as principal chief, was it because she wasn't capable, or because she was a woman?
I would say because she was a woman.
Yeah.
You can't say that for every voter, but the gist of it is because the most negative things that you heard were because she was a woman. And again, you have to put this in context, because she ran for deputy chief first. Not a lot of people talk about that era and what happened in that era, because she was only in that seat for 2 years when she assumed the role of principal chief, and then everything goes down in history. So it was a very volatile time. Sorry, I interrupted somebody who was going to talk.
Oh, no, that's good. Christina, were you going to add something?
And it should be noted that after seeing her leadership in her last election, she was elected with 83% of the vote with 2 male opponents.
Hallelujah.
So they learned. Now, when she was first chief, she went into a meeting and they didn't have a seat for her. And she went out and this is a lesson to girls. When somebody doesn't have a seat for you, bring in a chair. The next time, and they would talk to her, the next time they had a meeting, she had arranged so that the microphones were under her control, so she could shut off someone else's microphone when they tried to talk over her. So when people try to treat you with disrespect, because you're female, figure out how to get the power. Or in this case, the voice and the microphone.
I think there's a lot of claps out there. I think it's great to hear. And I'm also curious if you could maybe offer a few suggestions for students or people in their everyday of how do you even start to overcome some of these obstacles. And I think it can be really intimidating to challenge it when you want to speak your voice, to speak your mind or have your voice heard. I know you've been involved in the women's movement as an organizer. Do you have any suggestions for students out there of how they might be able to get involved?
Well, one thing is, again, bringing it back to Wilma. Wilma talked about how in meetings at the Indian Center, she was afraid to speak. Other people weren't afraid to speak. Those were mostly men. And this is not to denigrate men, but they have more of a sense of entitlement. Wilma was afraid, and she said, finally, she was sitting there thinking, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. And so she got up and spoke. And after she spoke, she learned a couple of lessons. One is, it won't kill you to get up and say something. Second, don't be afraid of making mistakes. Because if you're going to try something challenging, you risk mistakes and you risk failure. The most important thing to learn from those is what you learn. Because if you don't take the chance, you'll never learn.
I think that's a really great and powerful message. And speaking of using your voice, Celie, do we have any questions or comments?
Go ahead. So in the film, there's a woman and she's talking and saying that her and Wilma were to spend the entire month of May at Wilma's kitchen table making a book, but she died before they were able to make it. So what was that book about?
Did everybody hear that?
Gloria?
Yeah, this Gloria. I don't know. Christina might know. I don't know what the book was about.
Can you ask the question? Oh, yeah. They were doing, and I'm trying to find it on old computers. They have cooperated on a couple of books. One was an American, not American, a compendium, put that in children's terms, but of women's history and leadership. Then Gloria and Wilma were working on another book that Gloria just mentioned to me, but I can't remember what. I'm going to try to look through all her old files and find and find whatever still exists there. I was cleaning up stuff and found 17 pages of a book Wilma had started on Charlie, her husband, and I still continued to go through and find things. We're putting together Wilma's stuff to go into the archives at Smith College, which has a collection of important women leaders. It's a women's college in Massachusetts, and it's pulling together important women leaders.
And just to clarify, important women leaders, I mean, speaking of that, Gloria Steinem, when you say Gloria, you're talking about Gloria Steinem, and she's a predominant feminist and was a huge leader in the women's movement in the 1960s, and still today is a huge advocate for equal rights and women's rights. And so I think if people classes maybe haven't heard of her before, she's worth looking into. Her alongside many other female leaders have really advocated for. Are we good for time?
We got about.
We got a few
we
more,
should wrap up.
We got a few more minutes for maybe a few more questions, and I wanted to touch on one more thing, Gina, if you're still with us, because this is the title of the film and it's about Wilma Mankiller. I'm sure students are curious about a name like Mankiller, especially with someone that's such a staunch feminist. Can you talk a little bit about the historical significance of this name? And I know Wilma makes a joke about it in the film, and
I didn't know it was a joke. I always thought that was the truth.
And I think there is some truth to it.
No, back in the 1700s, Mom was actually able to trace our ancestry and our name back to an area by Tellico, Tennessee, and to an ancestor in the 1700s, like 1720s. And what the ancestor's job was to do was to protect the village. And at some point, the name was White Mankiller, and it was shortened to Mankiller. And when removal happens and you're forced to be removed, and then they're taking down names and they're trying to differentiate people in, rations or, trying to find a place for you to live or whatever, you have to have two names in the white world. In the Cherokee world, you could only have one or whatever. And so Mankiller then became the surname for the family and just kept it from removal time on.
And historically, interestingly enough, there was a man killer who went to England in the mid-1700s. Yeah, so, they actually had a treaty with England before they did with anybody else, any of the colonies or any of that.
Yeah, it's an interesting tidbit of history, and it's important when you're kind of piecing these story together. Mike, were you going to add something?
And thinking about women and their roles and stuff, it reminded me of a quick little story. Do I got time to share that?
Sure.
I've actually got to go. I'm late for another meeting, you all. Thank you so much for allowing me to be on this call. To all the students, continue learning. All through life, just continue learning. You guys have a good day.
Thanks for joining us, Gina.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, so there's three young men out hiking, a Blackfeet, a Crow, and a Lakota. And they come across this raging river, and they don't know how to get across. And so tobacco is really sacred to all the tribes out here in Montana, and I think to a lot of tribes across the U.S. So the Crow man puts out tobacco, sets it on the ground, and says a prayer. It says, "Creator, give me the strength to get across this river." Poof, he gets these big muscles on his arms and legs and hops in that river and starts swimming. Almost drowns, but he makes it to the other side. His Blackfeet friend's watching this, so he puts out tobacco. "Creator, give me the tools to get across this river." Poof, a little canoe appears there and a paddle, starts paddling across that river. The canoe smashes up on some rocks, almost drowns, but he makes it. Lakota guy's watching this, so he puts out tobacco. Says, "Creator, give me the intelligence to get across this river." Poof, turns into a Lakota woman. She pulls out a map and finds a bridge. Usually women have a lot more intelligence than us guys. I thought I'd just share that. So.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really wonderful note to end on. I hope you guys, if you weren't able to watch this film, you're able to watch it in its entirety and continue writing notes of wonder and observation as you dive more into the story of Wilma Mankiller and other Native American women and leaders that have contributed so much to their communities. I want to thank Christina for joining us, Mike for joining us, Gina, who's already left us, and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences for partnership sponsoring this film club and offering us the opportunity to make diverse options within our curriculum. I think it's really important. You guys have been amazing in your contributions. Before you leave, I would love on your pieces of paper if you could write just a 3-2-1 exercise of 3 things you learned, 2 things you found interesting, and 1 question you might still have. And if you give them to your teacher, perhaps she can send them in to us, and we will be able to share those with Christina or Gina or Mike if they're interested. So thank you so much. I'm signing off. If you want to have any closing remarks, Christina, before we say goodbye, and Mike?
I thank you for what you're doing. When I was in school, none of this happened. Your commitment, Mike, the teachers, and I watched the kids watch. It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you guys for asking great questions. Continue to do so. And if you have any questions for us, do not be shy. As Christina says, use your voice. We want to hear it. And enjoy the rest of today. Have a good rest of the week. Thank you.